Welcome to the first in a series of podcasts where we're hearing about examples of highly effective practice identified during a recent national thematic where we looked at local authority approaches to supporting school improvement. HM inspectors visited all 32 local authorities to look at how local authorities support schools to improve. In today's podcast, we're going to hear from West Dunbartonshire Council colleagues who will talk about their council's approach to supporting effective improvement planning and standards and quality reporting. We'll hear more about how council officers collaborated with school leaders to develop the West Dunbartonshire Council Improvement Framework. So I'm going to hand over to our colleagues and ask them to introduce themselves. Julie, can you begin?
I'm Julie McGrogan, Senior Education Officer. My responsibilities here in West Dunbartonshire are for the improvement framework and education development, and I'm also the lead officer for the Scottish Attainment Challenge. Susan, I'll hand over to you.
I'm Susan Gray, an Education Officer who works with Julie on support and challenge of our schools related to the improvement framework.
Thank you very much and welcome. So we're going to talk about your improvement area. So I guess the first question is, can I ask you to begin by setting out what was the improvement area? Talk a little about how you knew that it was an improvement area, and you might want to talk about some of the types of information and data that you used. And I believe, Julie, you're going to start on this one. So if I could ask you to say a little, thank you.
Thanks, Anne. The context in which we began this improvement strategy was one where there were new national directives in terms of the National Improvement Framework, our refreshed local authority strategic plan, and then our local knowledge of implementation and delivery within our schools and early learning centres. And what we were aware of was within the education system was hearing about over bureaucratic systems, a need to streamline priorities, a need to really narrow down the focus to ensure that whilst we led and guided and managed improvement, it led to very data-informed outcomes for our children and young people, whilst also enabling the system to improve at the same time. So that was the context in which this improvement strategy was launched. And we reframed it around looking closely at what we're trying to achieve for our children, young people, families and communities, and redesigned how we then planned improvement. So the schools and ELCs, through evaluation with them, had identified that they were finding managing all of the competing priorities that they were being tasked with delivering on complex and challenging, and therefore we reframed it around improvement planning at the learner level, the practitioner level, the leader level and the system level, and asked the schools to then rethink how and primarily what were the outcomes at each of those 4 levels within the service. And we also then looked at 3 to 5 year strategic planning around outcomes, because again, feedback was very clear that some of the short-term planning, some of the short-term outcomes that they were being asked to deliver on were not achievable, and therefore we had to be realistic in terms of the outcomes that they were being asked to achieve. And we then engaged in a programme of consultation and evaluation with them about whether or not they wanted this change. We worked with a team of head teachers who were both highly experienced and some new head teachers to really gauge with them what they felt was of value in terms of structures and approaches to improvement planning. So that was one key strand of work that we launched. In terms of the standards and quality reporting, again, we felt there wasn't clarity around what was expected. Was it actually of relevance and meaning to their local context and local community? And also, was it fit for purpose within the decade of the 2020s? So we had to look at how we could modernise our approach to that, but also make it meaningful and relevant to our to their schools and local communities.
Thanks, Julie. Susan, would you like to add to that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
As Julie said, we very much wanted to refocus the way in which leaders plan for improvement by ensuring that it was outcome driven. And at the time when we looked at the consultation through our improvement framework, we had evaluated that the improvement plans were not as effective as being a vehicle to drive change and improvement as they should have been. And at times there were far too many priorities. The priorities weren't leading to improved outcomes for learners. We weren't seeing the impact of the improvement plan on children and young people's experiences in the classroom. So we very much sharpened it, as Julie said, to look at the end of year one, what would you want to see, feel for young people and children that you serve? If that's what you want, what would the outcome need to be for you as a leader? What would you need to be better at, be able to do? What would you need to ensure your staff knew and were able to do? And your families and communities, what would they need to know and be able to do? And what outcomes would they have? Always taking it back to that locus of the learner and the so what factor. And we're forever saying to everybody, so what, you're doing that, so what? What's the difference for those that you serve? So we very much looked at the data that we had gathered through the improvement framework and looked again at supporting our leaders to be able to plan in a different way. But no change comes easily. And in terms of that shift in mindset about how to plan, they were at the end of a 3-year cycle of which they were comfortable with. We had engaged in a lot of conversation about the impact of that, and the head teachers and leaders in our early year centres had evaluated it. They thought it could be better. So we were pushing it an open door in terms of our next step. But to enable us to get it to a place quite quickly where we wanted it to be, we had to do a lot of work around exemplification, about looking at our key local authority priorities and exemplifying alongside our leaders. So if you were looking at the implementation of the circle framework, what would the outcomes for learners look like, feel like, sound like? And what would you need to do as a leader, the practitioners, the families and communities, to enable the children to have a better experience? We then took each of those priorities. So, for example, assessment is for learning, numeracy, assessment and moderation, circle, play, all of these different big local authority priorities, and really wanted to help our leaders to make sense of that. And something that we really wanted them to do was to plan over a 3-year period. Which priorities in year one would they engage with? Which would they embed? Which would they evaluate? And which would they extend? Because in the start of a new cycle, they're not starting from a blank page. It's not year one for everyone for play-based play as pedagogy. So we're then saying, if that's what you're doing, if you're engaging with a new approach to play as pedagogy, are you going to do it at leader level? Are you going to do it at practitioner level? Are you going to do it with families and communities? How are you going to manage the implementation of that change to ensure there was real depth and real impact? So to help us to do that, we had time set aside with our leaders. We did a lot of consultation, but we also created a Padlet that had exemplification. So as AIFL, a waggle, what a good one looks like. We did all the waggles for all these local authority improvement priorities as a starter for 10 to help people to consider where they might be, and also to help people see the language that we were hoping to be used around evaluation, around sharp outcomes for improvement. So that helped us to get from a place where improvement planning was too many priorities, not clearly focused on outcomes, to improvement plans that were sharper in their focus with a smaller number of well-judged priorities for year one. And that's where we got to in terms of the data that we used and how we then changed and shifted the mindset around improvement planning.
It may be helpful also to say that we integrated within that their pupil equity planning, because at one point they had separate pupil equity plans. They had their school improvement plan. They then had their ongoing evaluative activity that was then shaping and reshaping what they were doing. And we made a conscious decision and worked collaboratively with our attainment advisor and agreed that they could include that within the structured improvement plan rather than separate ones, because we were absolutely committed to tackling bureaucracy. And again, because we were really clear on these levels, the 4 levels of learner, practitioner, leader, the outcomes were more clearly defined, and within the improvement plan there is a very clear section around output in terms of data and performance measures that the school would then aspire to achieve, and that we monitor regularly in terms of whether or not they're managing to achieve those output measures. So whilst there's outcomes in terms of those levels, there's also very clear performance data planned and identified by the schools and early learning centres that are either based on evaluative activity against the quality indicators and or based on their attainment and equity data. And also now in this next phase of improvement, the attendance data as well, because that's obviously a major area of focus as forward.
That's great. Thanks very much. So we discussed another question, which was about how did you tackle this and what did you do and who was involved. And I think you've already set that out really well in terms of how you did tackle this improvement area, and some of the examples of how you worked in partnership with the staff at all levels. Are there any practical elements or any detail on outputs that you think that would be helpful to others to hear about? Anything in addition to what you've already mentioned, because you've mentioned a few already. Anything else you would like to add to that?
I think in terms of practical advice, we launched the consultation at our Education Leaders Conference. We then ensured there was protected time where there was officers with head teachers to then, and it was Susan who led on this, development sessions for heads and protected time sessions, where the single focus was on this model of development, and we had exemplification produced, which are still working documents. We are very clear that whilst we develop and identify an area of improvement or development, as this was, we consult and collaborate with our head teachers, we consult and collaborate with our national colleagues, but we also are very open to feedback and change and adaptation. So in the practical implementation of this, we're also very, very respectful of where a particular school or ELC may be. So you need to be aware in that practical implementation, has a particular establishment got the right conditions to implement this change? And as a service, that's how we approach, is ensuring we've created the right conditions for change. So we have to temper what we do against the feedback we're getting around the capacity that we know our schools and heads have for coping with this change. We were absolutely committed post-COVID to the sharp and focus to accelerate progress mantra that was being promoted nationally through the Attainment Challenge, and we used that within this improvement strategy, that we needed to sharpen the focus to accelerate progress. But practically, you need to listen to what people are saying and where people are at. So if it's a brand new head teacher into a new school, what's your expectations there in terms of capacity to implement this new agenda? And therefore, that's why these very focused single item development sessions that were led by us, gave us time to then bespoke it and personalise it to an individual context. That was then also followed up by our annual programme of monitoring and review, where there's very clear termly focus for the schools. So obviously term 1 is monitoring and reviewing with them their planning and the quality of their planning, but in a supportive way. Support and challenge.
Sounds like it. Thanks, Julie. Could you give an example of the single item development sessions that you talked about? Could you give an example of what that would be? Thanks, Susan.
Not at all. What we do is we identify from the self-evaluation of the school, from the priorities within the improvement plan, from the data that we gather, and we're very committed to a data strategy where we identify the data we want to capture, the right data at the right time for the right reason, and we use that data set in its entirety, and we then identify particular focuses for improvement. So, for example, one focus for improvement were around inclusive practices, and that real sharp focus on what that would look like, what would high quality provision look like, what would be the steps to improvement you would need to take to enable you to achieve that. Another, we looked at high quality planning and literacy and numeracy. And again, the same focus, what does your data tell you? Where is your starting point? What's your vision for success, and what might the steps be that you would take to achieve that? Another example would be environments for learning. What does high quality environments for learning look like? How do they support play as pedagogy? What does that look like through your school? What does that look like through the BGE? Another sharp focus, I'll give you one more, I can go on and on. We looked at the particular focus around insight data and taking some of those particular aspects. For example, our highest performing 20%, looking at that data in your school, what does that look like at the output level? Therefore, what does that tell us about your learning and teaching? What does that tell us about your curriculum? What does that tell us about the leadership of that? So really trying to make the connections for leaders around the connections of the QIs to the data, the connections of how the QIs link into your school improvement planning. So if you're looking at one particular aspect of creativity, for example, how do those QIs of leadership, of improvement and change, learning, teaching, assessment, curriculum, inclusion, how do they all knit together to give you high quality improvement methodology? So that was the way that we sort of focused, that single focus for improvement, to sharpen people on one area and really unpack collaboratively, getting everybody's experience and everyone's lens about what that would look like, but using the frameworks that are there to help us, such as HMIE, such as How Good Is Our ESL, to sort of frame the conversation around that. Something else that might be interesting for you to hear was around how the governance of the impact of the revised approach to improvement planning, and that's through our West Dunbartonshire Equity and Excellence Board that the Chief Education Officer chairs, and that then enables the impact of school improvement to be scrutinised. For example, the impact of it on ASIL data, the impact of it on insight, the impact of it on school evaluations through inspection, the impact of improvement planning on our improvement framework reporting processes. Are we seeing that the improvement plan, as I said at the start, is a vehicle that's leading to change and improvement? So I think that governance board helps us as central officers have real accountability for our work, but also it's sort of that golden thread of accountability that feeds from system level right the way through to learner level.
Who's involved in the board, Susan?
Julie, do you might want to?
So, and the Chief Education Officer chairs it. All senior education officers attend, and education officers, and our 5 local learning communities are led by head teachers. So there are head teachers who attend as well, and we look at our priorities linked to our excellence and equity strategy, and then reports are submitted to that board by either officers or the local learning community head teachers, and then those are discussed, and as Susan said, there is scrutiny around the work, and then improvement actions identified for us either at service level, local learning community level, or at establishment level. And I think in terms of the establishment level, that is where we absolutely apply a proportionate approach. So whilst we have our strategic objectives and our strategic plan, we have to, in terms of our every individual establishment, have single item agenda focus for them as well. So we have it at strategic level, but then we have it at operational level, and that's where we implement our proportionate pathways model of support and challenge, which fulfills a number of domains in terms of improvement. Central to that, obviously, within the context of this podcast, what's the value of the improvement plan on delivering improvement? How are they evaluating that and reporting that within their standards and quality? So that's a key piece of information we use to look at the quality of the planning, the quality of the evaluations, but then also there are a far wider range of data and information used to then inform how we proportionately support and challenge our schools.
So Julie, could you tell us a bit about the impact and outcomes? What was the result? And in particular, how did you measure the success?
So in terms of impact and outcomes, obviously we're all working towards the National Improvement Framework outcomes, and then there was the individual establishment outcomes, and we were very aware of the equity and excellence focus in our work, and therefore there were clear outcome measures we were able to use to evaluate that there was a positive impact, particularly when it came to narrowing the attainment gap. So that was one key indicator that the improvement work, where we'd looked very closely at excellence delivered through equity, there was an improved outcome. We still have work to do there, and we have not arrived and delivered all that we aspired to with regards to that aspiration and outcome. Another area of real focus for us was building capacity for improvement. So therefore, from our very close engagement and monitoring and feedback from our senior leaders, it was clear that they saw there was added value in the work that we were doing with them. And also, and most importantly of all, was the quality of what our children and young people are receiving. So we're seeing across the service consistent approaches to learning, teaching, assessment, to wellbeing, inclusion, to assessment, moderation. Again, though, the challenge, and to go back to your previous question, it's about ensuring that the levels of variability across and within schools and early learning centres are limited, and that's a journey we're still on. And we're using what is our intelligence about quality as a result of our visits, quality as a result of the outcomes and measures we have, whether that's attainment or equity, and outcomes and measures from feedback from staff to then identify the next steps for us. We're critically aware of the current budget context, and where as a system we have to continually evolve and improve, and that's why we've begun to look again at the next phase of our improvement framework.
That's really helpful, and preempting the next question, which is about, it's been some time since the national thematic, so really interested in what's changed, what's moved on in the stage that you're at now. Can you say a wee bit more about that?
So to go back a number of years, when we embarked on this journey of improvement through the improvement framework, which started 10 years ago, we were absolutely committed to collective efficacy and collaborative improvement, balancing that alongside scrutiny. And I know the word scrutiny is not popular, but we have to look at how we are engaging at a scrutiny level within our system, our education system, to ensure that there are robust approaches there. But we can't just have a system that only has scrutiny, robust measures, that doesn't then look at our staff capability, our staff capacity, and how we're growing and nurturing that capacity through sharing the learning across and within the system locally, but then also with our colleagues from other authorities. And that's where, through the West Partnership, through the Quads work, we've got an opportunity there to further grow, learn and develop. And we're already seeing the benefits of our Quads work and the partnership we've forged with our colleague authorities just now, again, with a number of areas of focus, but one of those is looking at how we are building capacity across our authorities through improvement. So the next phase of our work is looking at that network learning system. We've built capacity initially looking at the school improvement partnership model that came from a lot of the London Challenge work, but we've looked at how we build capacity for true and robust evaluation by colleagues with colleagues. So it's not colleagues joining the improvement programme and only benefiting in terms of them having an experience, but benefiting the system and benefiting the quality of what their colleagues are doing. So the next phase is absolutely looking at where we can further empower our local learning communities to have ownership of improvement, but ensure that there's very robust approaches there when it's colleagues engaged with colleagues. And the reason we can do that is because we've created the conditions for that through the work that we've done over the last number of years. I think if I was giving any recommendations to another authority around that, if you just parachute that in, but you've not created the conditions for that by ensuring that your schools understand the what and the why of how we want to improve and the value of working collectively and authentically with your colleagues on that improvement work, I think it could cause strain and tension. And you asked me in part one about challenges, and that is one of those challenges that we have, is about the engagement and the authentic engagement of people within these improvement processes. So where we're going next is really strengthening that approach in terms of network learning system. But as an authority, we are still committed to ensuring we have a central group of experts who moderate, because whilst you distribute that ownership and that leadership, you still need to have experts. And those experts are within and across the service and our colleague authorities. So that's our next phase of our work.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. And you moved directly into the last question, which is about the advice that you would give to other local authorities who may be trying to tackle some of the same improvement areas as you are. And we know that from the findings in the national thematic. So yeah, it's about what advice would you give to another local authority? And, you know, is there anything that should be non-negotiable, for example, or things that you would suggest that you avoid from your experience and lessons learned?
I think for me, a non-negotiable is having respect for our head teachers and our school leaders and the work that they're doing, and a mutual respect between them and those of us who work at the centre, and that we are honest and robust and we do support and challenge one another. We personally, I've ascribed in my leadership to don't give feedback if you can't take feedback. So advice at a service level is to listen to the feedback and act upon the feedback. But when there is that mutual relationship there, that then means when we are working with our schools, we can give them feedback and they have to then engage with the feedback we're giving them. So that's one big piece of advice. Another piece of advice is ensure that you are data informed. That's not a new concept. It's one that was very much at the forefront of the improvement work that came from the Attainment Challenge, and we benefited from that as a challenge authority, which meant we were having to again look very closely at our data and our use of that for improvement. And then it was ensuring we had the right people doing the right jobs in terms of school and ELC support and challenge.
That's really interesting, Julie. Is there anything else, any other advice?
I think a big influence on us in the shape and form of what we do here has been that concept of self-improving systems and self-evaluation for self-improvement, coupled with continuous development, continuous learning. So these are not new concepts to any of us, but I think if you really are committed to those, it means that every day is a learning day. So therefore, in terms of us, we look at it from the ground up in terms of the work we do collaboratively with our schools and early learning centres from all layers within the school and early learning centres leadership domain. Then we look at it within our authority and across partner authorities. In particular, at the moment, we're working closely within a quad and we're learning from that. But then also from our national agencies in terms of national directives, national expertise, national feedback, and how we reflect on that to help us think and grow. And also, we worked closely with Glasgow University at the initial phases of this work, but we've also worked closely with our the inspectorate, and that's helped guide some of what we've done too in terms of some of the models that we have within our improvement framework. So we're continuously learning, continuously developing, and open to both support and challenge.
So Julie, the last and final question is about challenges. Did you experience any challenges along the way? How did you tackle these? Can you say a little about that?
There are a couple of layers to the challenge dimension. There's the strategic challenge as an authority, where having improvement and quality at the heart of everything we do, our major priority. But as officers working in a council, there are many competing priorities that we have to respond to. So it's ensuring in terms of our work that we continually prioritise a focus on improvement. And we know the current context in education where there are many national directives, where the media is playing out a number of key themed areas that we will all have our opinion on, and it's ensuring that we continually strive to challenge ourselves and be resilient ourselves in terms of that ongoing development of what's being delivered out there in our schools. So at that strategic level, it's balancing what we know are our priorities, balancing where we've identified we need to target our work, coupled with then all the other pressures and tensions that we're facing strategically. Operationally, we have obviously a very structured approach in terms of a cycle model where schools are within a cycle of a 3-yearly review programme with a particular area of focus. There's then obviously the annual programme that is informed by intelligence, whether that's attainment information for our schools, whether it's outcome information in terms of other data sets we've used to inform whether we would engage with a school more frequently. And then there's also contextual information around schools and early learning centres, and that's where there can be a challenge because as a service we have to be people-centred whilst outcome focused, And the challenge there is responding to the context of individual schools and at a human level in terms of our staff and where they are in terms of readiness to be able to hear some of the messaging, and then ensure in how we're delivering the messaging, delivering the programme that we have, that we are ensuring that the level of support and challenge that is delivered is relevant to a particular context, keeps driving what is the big objective, but also ensures that there's a human element within that we then can ensure we are adaptive in our style.
Thanks very much, Julie. That was a really, really helpful response to that question. So my sincere thanks to yourself and Susan for taking the time to record this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.